Stephanie Kelton appeared with Farid Zakaria a couple of days ago, and I think what she had to say about the federal budget deficit and deficit spending is very, very important. You know, many people have a tendency to believe that the federal budget deficit somehow shares the budgeting that we do personally in common. Of course, it's not the case. She's one of the proponents of modern monetary theory, something that we've discussed before and have had several programs on. Check this out, and then we will take it on the other side.
Stephanie Kelton is a professor of economics and public policy and the author of The Deficit Myth. Welcome, Stephanie. One of the things that you have talked about in your book is that when we think about this question of are we spending too much, will this kind of deficit spending cause problems like inflation? You say it's as if the last 30 years of history didn't happen. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, Fareed, for so many years, we have been taught to think about government deficits as something that's inherently irresponsible. Maybe in a time of crisis, like after the financial crisis and the Great Recession or during the COVID pandemic, we make allowances and we say, well, okay, we have to run some deficits because it's a moment of crisis. But in more normal times, we're told that deficits are something that we ought to strive to avoid, that governments ought to balance their budgets, that they should effectively balance like a budget like a household, that deficits are dangerous because they do things like driving up interest rates, making our long-term debt unsustainable, producing a slower growing economy, putting us at risk of national bankruptcy, insolvency, turning into Greece, the kind of thing that we saw in 2010 with many countries in Europe struggling with debt. So we've been taught to think of deficits as something that's inherently dangerous and risky. And I think the last 30 years, as you just said, really should cause us to rethink a lot of that.
And explain what you mean by that. We've been spending, we've run up large deficits. Countries like Japan have run up huge deficits and no inflation.
Yeah, Japan's been running large fiscal deficits for the last 3 decades, and you're right, with little inflation to show for it. The U.S. has been running fiscal deficits basically my entire life, with the exception of really 4 years during the Clinton presidency. And, you know, we have just witnessed in the last 18 months or so, Congress commit about $5 trillion to fighting the pandemic, supporting the economy. And what did we end up with? We ended up with the shortest recession in U.S. history. So we have demonstrated the power of fiscal policy, what it is possible to do, lifting nearly half of all the kids in this country out of poverty, supporting families, supporting small and large businesses, protecting this economy through the pandemic. And it works without producing all of the negative consequences that we've been taught to associate with deficits.
What about the argument that now you are seeing inflation? Larry Summers has argued that that right now, because of the COVID relief spending that was in his view too much, you are seeing inflation. Summers, I should explain, does support a lot of the social spending in the infrastructure bills, but he feels like all of it together is producing inflation, and the numbers do seem to be ticking up, right?
Well, look, one of the first things that we teach students in their very first economics course is not to confuse correlation with causation. So yes, we have had 2 things happen. We have had a huge increase in fiscal support. So large government deficits that have supported the economy and pulled us out of a recession very, very quickly. And yes, we have higher than normal inflationary pressures, not just here in the US, Fareed, but of course around the world. And so you could look at these 2 things and say they're happening alongside one another. Therefore, it must be evidence that the government has pushed too far with fiscal policy, that in fact the spending is creating the extra inflationary pressures we see today. I don't think that's right at all. And if you look at what, let's say, the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, they've got a research staff, and some of their researchers just within the last 2 weeks published a study asking this exact question. How much of the current inflation we're experiencing can we trace to the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package that was passed in March? In other words, is Larry right? Is Larry Summers right that that is what's been driving a lot of the inflation that we are currently experiencing? What they found is that the answer is unequivocally no, that this year, that spending will add something like 0.3 percentage points to the inflation index that the Federal Reserve cares most about, and that next year it will add about 0.2% to inflation. In other words, it is practically negligible. And what we're dealing with are supply chain and reopening. The pressures related to those kinds of challenges are pushing inflation higher, but it doesn't appear that it is correct to say that the government pushed spending too far.
Do not conflate correlation with causation. Do not do that. And that is exactly what she's saying. The inflation today is caused by many different factors. When it comes to oil, let's remember one important fact. A very important fact is the following. There is never a shortage of oil. We have cartels that control the amount of oil placed on the market. It has nothing to do with supply and demand in this particular domain. Secondly, we have to remember that inflation has a lot to do with who has pricing power. The increase in medical health care costs has nothing to do with what the goods cost the originators of the services at all. It's simply what the market can bear. You get a broken leg, you're going to have to go to the hospital and get it fixed, and no matter what they charge you, you're going to have to pay. That is how it works. Now, there are some pressures that we have based on things like the supply chain. That also is a fault of the private sector. We'll discuss that at some other time as well. Remember, I do not conflate correlation with causation at all. It is also important to note, as long as you have supply, sufficient supply of any product, any service, you cannot have inflation unless you have the capitalists with pricing power that decides that we are going to make those prices go up. Do not be fooled into a crony capitalism that uses every excuse possible to suck you dry. We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead, number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.